Let's go straight to the House of Commons, where Chancellor Jeremy Hunt is presenting an autumn statement.
To tackle the cost of living crisis and rebuild our economy. Our priorities are stability, growth and public services. We also protect the vulnerable, because to be British is to be compassionate, and this is a compassionate Conservative government. We are not alone in facing these problems, but today we respond to an international crisis with British values. We are honest about the challenges and we are fair in our solutions. Yes, we take difficult decisions to tackle inflation and keep mortgage rates down. But our plan also leads to a shallower downturn, lower energy bills, higher growth and a stronger NHS and education system. Three priorities then today: stability, growth and public services. I start with stability. Mr. Speaker, high inflation is the enemy of stability. It means higher mortgage rates, more expensive food and fuel bills, businesses failing and unemployment rising. It erodes savings, causes industrial unrest and cuts funding for public services. It hurts the poorest the most and eats away at the trust upon which a strong society is built. The Office for Budget Responsibility confirms global factors are the primary cause of current inflation. Most countries are still dealing with the fallout from a once-in-a-century pandemic. The furlough scheme, the vaccine rollout and the response of the NHS did our country proud, but they all have to be paid for. The lasting impact on supply chains has made goods more expensive and fuelled inflation, and this has been worsened by a made-in-Russia energy crisis. Putin's war in Ukraine has caused wholesale gas and electricity prices to rise to 8 times their historic average. Inflation is high here, but higher in Germany, the Netherlands and Italy. Interest rates have risen here, but faster in the US, Canada and New Zealand. Growth forecasts have fallen here, but fallen further in Germany. The International Monetary Fund expects 1/3 of the world's economy to be in recession this year or next. So the Bank of England, which has done an outstanding job since its independence, now has my wholehearted support in its mission to defeat inflation. And I today confirm we will not change its remit. But we need fiscal and monetary policy to work together. And that means the government and the bank working in lockstep. It means, in particular, giving the world confidence in our ability to pay our debts. British families make sacrifices every day to live within their means, and so too must their government, because the United Kingdom will always pay its way. I understand the motivation of my predecessor's mini-budget, and he was correct. He was correct to identify growth as a priority. But unfunded tax cuts are as risky as unfunded spending, which is why we reversed the planned measures. As a result, government borrowing has fallen, the pound has strengthened, and the OBR says today that the lower interest rates generated by the government's actions are already benefiting our economy and public finances. But, Mr. Speaker, credibility cannot be taken for granted. And yesterday's inflation figures show we must continue a relentless fight to bring it down, including a rock-solid commitment to rebuild our public finances. Richard Hughes and his team at the OBR today lay out starkly the impact of global headwinds on the UK economy, and I'm enormously grateful to him and his team for their thorough work. The OBR forecast the UK's inflation rate to be 9.1% this year and 7.4% next year. They confirm that our actions today help inflation to fall sharply from the middle of next year. They also judge that the UK, like other countries, is now in recession. Overall this year, the economy is still forecast to grow by 4.2%. GDP then falls in 2023 by 1.4%, before rising by 1.3%, 2.6% and 2.7% in the following 3 years. The OBR says higher energy prices explain the majority of the downward revision in cumulative growth since March. They also expect a rise in unemployment from 3.6% today to 4.9% in 2024, before falling to 4.1%. Today's decisions mean that over the next 5 years, borrowing is more than halved. This year, we're forecast to borrow 7.1% of GDP, or £177 billion. Next year, 5.5% of GDP, or £140 billion. Then by 2027-28, it falls to 2.4% of GDP, or £69 billion. As a result, underlying debt as a percentage of GDP starts to fall from a peak of 97.6% in 2025-6 to 97.3% in 27-28. I also confirmed 2 new fiscal rules. The first is that underlying debt must fall as a percentage of GDP by the 5th year of a rolling 5-year period. The second, that public sector borrowing over the same period must be below 3% of GDP. And the plan I'm announcing today meets both rules. Today's statement delivers a consolidation of £55 billion and means inflation and interest rates end up significantly lower. We achieve this, Mr. Speaker, in a balanced way. In the short term, as growth slows and unemployment rises, we will use fiscal policy to support the economy. The OBR confirm that because of our plans, the recession is shallower and inflation is reduced. Unemployment is also lower, with about 70,000 jobs saved as a result of our decisions today. Then, once growth returns, we increase the pace of consolidation to get debt falling. This further reduces the pressure on the bank to raise interest rates, because as Conservatives, we do not leave our debts to the next generation. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a balanced path to stability, tackling inflation to reduce the cost of living and protect pensioner savings whilst supporting the economy on a path to growth. But it means taking difficult decisions. Anyone who says there are easy answers is not being straight with the British people. Some argue for spending cuts, but that would not be compatible with high-quality public services. Others say savings should be found by increasing taxes, but Conservatives know that high-tax economies damage enterprise and erode freedom. We want low taxes and sound money, but Conservatives know sound money has to come first, because inflation eats away at the pound in people's pockets even more insidiously than taxes. So with just under half of the £55 billion consolidation coming from tax and just over half from spending, this is a balanced plan for stability. I turn first to our decisions on tax. I have tried to be fair by following 2 broad principles. Firstly, we ask those with more to contribute more, and secondly, we avoid the tax rises that damage growth. Although my decisions today do lead to a substantial tax increase, we have not raised headline rates of taxation, and tax as a percentage of GDP will increase by just 1% over the next 5 years. I start with personal taxes. Asking more from those who have more means that the first difficult decision I take on tax is to reduce the threshold at which the 45p rate becomes payable from £150,000 to £125,140. Those earning £150,000 or more will pay just over £1,200 more in tax every year. We're also taking difficult decisions on tax-free allowances. I'm maintaining at current levels the income tax personal allowance, higher rate threshold main national insurance thresholds and the inheritance tax thresholds for a further 2 years, taking us to April 2028. Even after that, we'll still have the most generous set of tax-free allowances of any G7 country. I'm also reforming allowances on unearned income. The dividend allowance will be cut from £2,000 to £1,000 next year and then to £500 from April 24. The annual exempt amount for capital gains tax will be cut from £12,300 to £6,000 next year and then £3,000 from April 24. These changes still leave us with more generous allowances than countries like Germany, Ireland, France and Canada. Because the OBR forecast half of all new vehicles will be electric by 2025, to make our motoring tax system fairer, I've decided that from then, electric vehicles will no longer be exempt from vehicle excise duty. Company car tax rates will remain lower for electric vehicles, and I've listened to industry bodies and will limit rate increases to 1 percentage point a year for 3 years from 2025. The OBR expects housing activity to slow over the next 2 years, so the stamp duty cuts announced in the mini-budget will remain in place, but only until the 31st of March 2025. After that, I will sunset the measure, creating an incentive to support the housing market and the jobs associated with it by boosting transaction during the period the economy most needs it. I now turn to business taxes. While I've decided to freeze the employer's NICS threshold until April 2028, we will retain the employment allowance at its new higher level of £5,000. This means 40% of all businesses will pay no NICS at all. The VAT threshold is already more than twice as high as the EU and OECD averages. I will maintain it at that level until March 26. My right honourable friend the Prime Minister successfully negotiated a landmark international tax deal to make sure multinational corporations, including big tech companies, pay the right tax in the countries they operate. I will implement these reforms, making sure the UK gets our fair share. Alongside further measures to tackle tax avoidance and evasion, this will raise an additional £2.8 billion by 27-28. I've also heard concerning reports of abuse and fraud in R&D tax relief for SMEs, so I've decided today to cut the deduction rate for the SME scheme to 86% and the credit rate to 10%, but increase the rate of the separate R&D expenditure credit from 13% to 20%. Despite raising revenue, the OBR have confirmed that these measures have no detrimental impact on the level of R&D investment in the economy. Ahead of the next budget, we'll work with industry to understand what further support R&D intensive SMEs may require. Next, windfall taxes. I have no objection to windfall taxes if they are genuinely about windfall profits caused by unexpected increases in energy prices. But I know the honourable members opposite are getting excited at the talk of windfall taxes. Can I just say that any such tax should be temporary, not deter investment, and recognise the cyclical nature of energy businesses. So, taking account of this, I've decided that...
So, Jeremy Hunt, the UK Chancellor, setting out his autumn statement. We've heard some of the changes that he is making so far. We've also heard some of the forecasts for the UK economy in the years ahead. Crucially, the Office for Budget Responsibility saying that it believes that the UK economy is now already in recession. The OBR forecast for GDP here in the UK falling by 1.4% GDP in 2023, then rising by 1.3%, 2.6%, 2.7% in the years after that. So certainly good news and very bad news in some of those forecasts coming from the OBR. Let's talk now to Dr. Nigel Fletcher, political historian at King's College London. Dr. Fletcher, thanks for being with us. What have you made of what Jeremy Hunt has said so far?
Well, I think it's a really difficult thing that he's got to be doing today. He's telling a a country and indeed his own party that there is no alternative other than some pretty difficult reductions in spending and some increases in taxes. And he's still going through those as we're speaking, but some of them have been fairly well trailed. A lot of these things are the diametric opposite of what we heard from Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. So whilst this would be a very difficult budget for any chancellor to have to deliver, doing so just a matter of weeks after his predecessor had stood up and argued that lowering taxes was the right thing to do at this time and to increase borrowing, it is an extraordinary spectacle, really. We are seeing sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, really, from Jeremy Hunt today.
Credibility cannot be taken for granted, he said, and the Labour benches across from him laughed and jeered at that point. Politically, looking ahead, is there any sense that the Conservative government is trying to front-load some of these difficult decisions to get them out of the way so that it can recover before the next election, or is the opposite happening?
Well, in some ways, I think the opposite is happening. There's some indications, although we haven't quite yet heard the section on public spending, but there was some indication in the briefing beforehand that a lot of those reductions will be postponed until after the next general election, that the indications will be set out and the assumptions in the numbers will suggest that spending will decline in future years. But in a sense, it's the opposite of front-loading it. It's actually saying that we will be doing these things in a few years' time. Of course, cynically, you might look at that and think that the Conservatives on current projections would not be in government at that time. So that's potentially quite worrying for Labour if you're looking at those projections coming in a few years' time. But whichever way you look at it, I think there's going to be some very difficult years ahead, even without those spending reductions kicking in the next few years. There certainly is not money available for the many pressures. And don't forget, we've got record inflation. And of course, that leads to increased demands for increased wages in the public sector. So there's a lot of demands on the public purse. And as we're hearing from Jeremy Hunt today, they simply don't have the resources to meet those, which is going to cause a lot of political problems.
And explain why, Dr. Fletcher, Jeremy Hunt sounded so at pains to stress his support for the Bank of England.
Yes, I think that's a reflection of the fact that there has been significant criticism of the current governor and the fact that, since the Labour government came in 1997 and changed the remit of the Bank of England, it has had this brief not only as a central bank and the duties that a central bank normally has, but it also has the responsibility for keeping inflation under control and to set interest rate policy. In order to do that, it has a mandate from the government to keep inflation low. So the fact that we've seen inflation growing to such a huge amount has led to a lot of criticism of the Bank of England. And there was some suggestion that there may be changes to its remit and that the mandate the government gives to it would be changed. He's clearly ruling that out. And I think actually that's part of the message of trying to reassure the markets. I think a chancellor expressing support for his central bank in these sorts of circumstances is probably something that's going to calm the markets rather than concern them.
While we've been talking, Jeremy Hunt has said that public sector spending will only grow at 1% for the 3 years after 2024. There's going to be a review into getting work-age people back into work to stop them being effectively economically inactive. We've heard that the state pension age review will be published early next year. I mean, this just reiterates some of the difficult decisions that the government is having to make. That's the phrase they keep using about this autumn statement. How will the Labour Party, do you think, attack this? Because there's a trap being laid, in a sense, with the Conservatives saying we're being sensible and sound money is our priority, and they will want to accuse Labour of being less responsible if they are attacked about this autumn statement that's being set out now.
Yes, it's a very great challenge to Labour, and it will be Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, who responds to this. Normally, when it's a full-scale budget, it's the Leader of the Opposition themselves who responds to it. Because this is only an autumn statement, although it has all of the impact of a budget, it will be responded to by Rachel Reeves as the Shadow Chancellor. And she's got a very difficult job. A lot of the things she's hearing won't have been confirmed until she's hearing them right now with financial market-sensitive announcements. The opposition doesn't get the customary advanced sight of it. So she will only be hearing some of these things for the first time, and she's got to stand up immediately and respond to it. And you're right. I think Labour have got some fairly large traps to avoid. If they suggest that the reductions in spending and the increase in taxes are the wrong thing to do, then you're almost suggesting that they're endorsing what Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng were trying to do. If they're objecting to the reversal of those things, and of course we saw how the markets reacted to that. So they have to be very careful, and I think that Rachel Reeves will try and balance the fact that she's not going to want to commit the Labour Party to very much in terms of specific measures that they might support or not, but she'll also want to lay the blame for the current situation squarely at the door of the government. So I would expect that a lot of her response will be, in general terms, attacking the fact that we've had this extraordinary turnaround from one budget statement to another, or from one mini budget to an autumn statement. This is an extraordinary 180-degree sort of turn by the government. And I think she's really got a fairly easy job in attacking that part of it, the sort of chaos in government and the fact that the interest rates increases that we've seen are largely being blamed on some of that. She's got a lot to attack there. But I think you're right. If she gets into talking about what the Labour Party would itself do, she's got a bit of a difficult problem there to address. She's got to be fiscally responsible and ensure that Labour's plans are credible. And also, of course, some of these things, the increases in taxes on the most wealthy, windfall taxes, she will be able to say that some of these things are things that Labour were calling for, and certainly Liz Truss had rejected. So she'll be able to declare some victories in actually having won the argument on some of those things, perhaps. But it is a difficult thing, and it always is for the opposition responding to statements like this. But I suspect that we'll hear a lot from her about the chaos of sort of changing direction and the responsibility of the government for the situation we find ourselves in.
Dr. Nigel Fletcher, thank you for walking us through all of that, political analyst and his political historian at King's College London.